Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, July 22nd around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about the ACC Media Days. They kick off today over in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we'll break down all of the biggest talking points. Obviously, the biggest talking point is going to be Florida State and Clemson and the pending legal cases against the ACC, but we'll see how that unpacks, and we'll get into some other talking points as well. Then we'll get into kind of an interesting conversation that has been happening for quite some time in college football. Who is the most competitive conference? Who is the best conference? Who are the teams that play the closest games? We'll break all of that down on today's show. Tom Fornelli did us a huge favor by compiling all this information, so we'll break it down on today's show. Then we'll get into Texas A&M. It feels like the Aggies are getting a little bit overlooked this season, likely because of how underlooked, I suppose, they were in the previous years under Jimbo Fisher, but Mike Elko is exactly where he wants to be, and we'll break down how I think the Aggies might just be a really dangerous team in the SEC this upcoming year. Then we'll get into a little bit of a recruiting update. We have LSU just absolutely tearing up the weekend. A number of big-time players came off the board. Florida got a huge commit, so we'll break down everything there. And then we'll get into kind of a new segment around here. I'm going to do contenders hot takes, so something around all the contenders across every single conference. I'll break down a hot take I have for their season, but we'll get into that slowly throughout the week. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcspodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's always good for the both of us. Again, if you want to use that, that's gsmcpodcast.net. But let's jump right in, because the ACC Media Days get underway today over in Charlotte, and there's a ton to break down. There's no two ways about that. This is the conference that is likely under the most turmoil going into this season, not only on the field but off the field, and it's going to be a very interesting year on the field as well. But obviously, there's going to be so much to talk about, and a lot of it is going to be taken up by Clemson and Florida State. But first, before we get into all the talking points, let's just break down the schedule for this week. You obviously have today, you have the commissioner, which is going to be fascinating to hear from him, hear what he has to say about everything that's going on around his conference. You have Florida State, Georgia Tech, a new SMU team coming in, and then Day 2 is a little bit more tame. You got Cal, Pitt, Stanford, Virginia Tech will be fascinating to hear from. And then Virginia, Tony Elliott kind of starting to pick up steam just a little bit in Charlottesville. And then you have Boston College, Duke, Louisville, Miami is the show of the week if you were to ask me. And then Wake Forest on that Wednesday. And then you close it out with Clemson, North Carolina State, and Syracuse. So we kind of bookend it with the two teams that everyone wants to hear from the most, Florida State and Clemson. But will definitely be a huge week for a number of things. But let's start right there with Florida State and Clemson, because they're going to be the talk. There's no two ways about that, and it's going to be all the off the field stuff that is going to be the most talked about thing. Obviously, you want to hear from the officials at these universities, the head coaches. Jim Phillips, more than anyone else, is who I want to hear from, but I do think there's going to be a little bit kind of an interesting approach, especially from the coaches here, where Dabo and Mike Norvell, the best you're probably going to get out of them is essentially, I'm focused on football right about now. I'm not necessarily worried about all the outside stuff. They'll worry about that, and I will just do my job, which is to coach football. That doesn't mean we won't get plenty out of this. We're going to get tons of university officials. We'll get some ADs possibly on record. We'll get different people from different backgrounds kind of interacting, and that tends to give us a little bit of juice around some of these topics. So it'll be really, really interesting to see what happens today and going forward throughout the week. But if Florida State and Clemson want out by 2025, a decision has to be made here pretty soon. So I have to assume we're going to hear something, whether it's, Clemson and Florida State are gearing up to make that decision and possibly jump to the Big 12, which seems like the only landing spot at this point, or we'll hear the opposite, say they're going to stick around for a little bit, try to kick the tires on the SEC and Big 10 a little bit more, and that would be a very interesting thing for the ACC going forward with just how that would work between those three entities. But at the end of the day, there's also big-time questions on the football field, and Jim Phillips obviously cannot necessarily answer those, so there's going to be tons of questions around these two teams on the football field because they're the two teams. They're the teams that are coming into this with the highest odds to win this conference, and there's some questions around him. There's no two ways about that. For Florida State, although we won't get to hear from DJ Uyunglele, which is obviously very disappointing, but he did it for a very nice reason, letting the guys from last year get their shine and go to the ACC Media Days. But there's going to be tons of questions about those transfers, particularly on the offensive side of the ball, trying to figure out, who's standing out, who's, not necessarily carrying the weight you want. Malik Benson is going to be huge. Roydell Williams, I could go on about the offensive transfers that they need to hit. So it's going to be really interesting to hear from some of these guys about how that's coming along. Is that team, where they want to be, or are the transfers coming in and it's just a little bit slower going than it was maybe a year ago or something like that? So that'll be really interesting to watch. And then for Clemson, it's all around that guy. There's no two ways about that. I think when you talk about Clemson this year, it's all Cade Klubnik, Garrett Riley. If those two can find a way to get on the same page, to be in lockstep, this is going to be a really hard offense to stop, because they do have some wide receivers on the outside finally that are up to the Clemson standards. And they're freshmen, to be fair, but they're both really, really talented kids. And I'm fascinated to hear from Cade Klubnik about, obviously, his connection with Garrett Riley, but also how Bryant Wesco's doing, how TJ Moore is doing, if they can, really play roles early on in the season. I tend to believe that Bryant Wesco is going to trot out there with the first teamers in the first game of the season. So I think this is going to be a very, very interesting week for those teams. Obviously, off the field is going to dominate the conversation, but the reality is I do think there is going to be a ton of questions on the field as well for these teams. And then you get into the team that Anthony just asked about here, and I think is going to actually dominate the conversation the same way that Texas did a week ago at the SEC Media Days. It's Miami. Miami is the team that everyone is looking towards this upcoming year, because there's a lot of people that don't want Miami to come back up to the top of college football, and there's a lot of people that really want it to happen. So it's going to be really fascinating to watch this unfold, but there's going to be some questions. There's no two ways about that. Cam Ward will be in attendance, so getting to hear from him about his connection with Shannon Dawson and how his rapport is going with the receivers that have come in. Xavier Restrepo and him seem to have a very, very good relationship at this point, but definitely will be interesting to hear from him. You also have Francisco Mauanoa making his appearance. Will be great to hear from him, because he's the leader of that defense. He might be the outright leader of this team, if I'm being totally honest. And hearing from him about guys like Tyler Barron, like Simeon Barrow Jr., like other transfers that are filling, Michelle Powell on the back end, hearing from him will really give us an idea of just how good this defense can really be. And then what Anthony just said is the biggest question that I have for this is, will Mario Cristobal be willing to just hand the reins off? Will he be willing to just say, I really trust in my coordinators to make the right decisions at the right times, and not be as micromanagey as he has been on the other as he has been throughout his career? It's created some big time problems, including that just disaster of a Georgia Tech game at the end of the year. So obviously that's going to be a big topic of conversation, but it feels like this is Mario's program for the first time since he's really taken over. Obviously, year 3 is kind of that year when you have your team, but it really feels like this team everything is moving in the right direction. The only thing that can really get in their way is themselves, and kind of in that way. So it'll be really, really interesting to kind of unpack that a little bit. But I do want to get into, obviously, Cam Ward is going to be a huge topic of conversations among the quarterbacks, but there's going to be a lot of quarterbacks there. Just almost too many, if I'm being totally honest. There will be 19 quarterbacks in attendance, and there's only 17 teams in this conference. And Florida State's not sending DJ. So who are the teams sending to, and why are they sending to? Well, it starts with Duke. Duke is sending Malik Murphy, and they're sending Grayson Loftus. I think they're battling for that job. I don't think that's decided, and it very well could be decided in some form or fashion this week, depending on how they carry themselves in these interviews. But that's kind of a side point. I do think Grayson Loftus holds a little bit better of a position as of right this second, but when you talk about upside, I think Malik Murphy wins that battle by fairly comfortable margin. And then you have Cal. They're bringing Francisco Mendoza and Chandler Rogers, and I think they haven't decided that one either. I would lean toward Mendoza making the first start, but I think Chandler Rogers, coming over from North Texas, is a very, very talented kid. I think UNC is bringing 2 as well. Max Johnson is battling with, I can't remember his first name. It's escaping me at the moment, but Harrell, they are battling for that spot. I think it's Max Johnson has the advantage right now, but who knows? I thought it was going to be just Max Johnson. It wasn't going to be a question, if I'm being totally honest. And then SMU is bringing 2 quarterbacks, which is interesting because it's going to be Preston Stone. He's going to be the starter. There's no two ways about that. But it sounds like they want to introduce you to the future of their program. They have a very, very talented young quarterback that absolutely will make some noise this upcoming year. So it'll be really interesting to watch that. And then you have some other guys. You have Cam Ward obviously coming, but Haynes King will be there. Thomas Castellanos, Kyle McCord, Grayson McCall, Cade Klubnik, Kyron Drones, Preston Stone. So many veterans that know so much about football and have played so much football, and it'll be really, really fascinating to hear from them. And then finally, you have the teams that are joining the league for the very first time. SMU being the team that is a little bit more of a dark horse in this company is definitely a very, very interesting thing. So it'll be really, really fascinating to watch how that kind of develops. And they're definitely a team that I think people should be circling just a little bit more in the ACC this upcoming year. And then you obviously have Stanford and Cal. I think they're kind of on the outskirts. Probably won't get too many sound bites from those two this week, but definitely a very, very interesting thing to watch. But I think there's going to be a ton of questions around the ACC and other talking points. You have Syracuse going into a very interesting year. Louisville, NC State, SMU, Virginia Tech, all of them are expecting big-time years. And then just watching Jim Phillips, every time he opens his mouth, something interesting is going to come out, whether it's for the ACC or against the ACC. And Anthony had some questions over here that I want to address, and I believe that SMU is the one bringing the two quarterbacks. Maybe I read that wrong. That is definitely a case. But I fully understand the not fully trusting Jim Phillips, because he hasn't necessarily knocked it out of the park, especially over the last little bit. He's definitely someone that has a lot to prove in this next little bit, that he can keep his conference afloat and he can compete with guys like Brett Yormark and Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, because right now he's running fourth in that race, and it's a pretty distant fourth. So that's obviously a huge worry for the ACC, and they'll have to deal with that as they kind of go over these next couple of months. But the reality is this is going to be a crazy week. And it's going to be a crazy week not just because of the stuff that we'll hear on the football field, because frankly, I think this is one of the most interesting conferences in the country, but everything off the field is going to be that much more important for this conference's future, for FSU and Clemson's future, for pretty much everyone else. It's going to be fascinating to watch, what happens with Clemson, and does it trigger UNC, NC State, Virginia, some of these other teams possibly joining in on this party. So it could be an explosive week. There's no two ways about that. Definitely will be a fascinating thing to watch. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to break down which conferences and which teams actually play the most competitive games. We always talk about the SEC and the Big Ten being the best conferences, but who are the most competitive? Who are the ones that you're tuning in pretty much every week, and you'll be able to find a number of games that are very close. But we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.